It was just after midnight in Milwaukee, when the silence of the city was shattered by a sudden burst of gunfire. The sound of bullets echoed through the narrow street, followed by the piercing crack of glass exploding across the sidewalk. Inside the car, 8-year-old Peaches Armstrong slumped forward, her last breaths escaping in panicked gasps. The headlights still glared against the darkness, casting a ghostly light on the scene, as if forcing the world to witness what had just happened. In the chaos, someone ran, and in that split second, a young woman's story, her dreams, her struggles, her place in a community that loved her, was forever silenced. But who was Peaches Armstrong? Why did her life end this way? And what chain of choices, betrayals, and dangers brought her to that lonely stretch of street where she met her fate? To understand, we have to rewind the story back to the life she built, the secrets she carried, and the world that never truly let her feel safe. Peaches Armstrong wasn't just a name in the news. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Born and raised in Milwaukee, she carried herself with the kind of resilience that people noticed. Those who knew her say she had a radiant laugh, the kind that filled a room even when her own heart was heavy. But beneath that joy lived a truth that shaped everything about her existence. Peaches was a transgender woman, carving out her identity in a city that didn't always embrace difference with kindness. Life wasn't easy. Like many trans women, Peaches faced rejection, judgment, and the constant weight of trying to exist authentically in a world that sometimes seemed determined to erase her. Yet she refused to shrink. She lived out loud, surrounding herself with a circle of friends who saw her for who she really was. Bold, funny, complicated, and endlessly loyal. But every story has shadows, and for Peaches, those shadows often came in the form of the people she let into her life. She trusted easily, sometimes too easily. She believed in second chances, in the idea that even people who stumbled deserved grace. And it was that openness, that vulnerability, that may have drawn danger to her doorstep. On that June night, hours before the gunfire, Peaches was seen out with people she knew. Laughter, conversation, the blur of music and neon lights. It was a night that should have ended like any other, tired, maybe a little drunk, but safe in her own bed. Instead, she found herself in a car, moments away from disaster, with someone who would soon be gone but whose presence in that car would change everything. The police would later piece together fragments of her final movements from surveillance cameras and witness accounts. But what cameras cannot capture are the unspoken fears, the nagging suspicions, or the tension that might have filled the air inside that car. Did Peaches sense something was wrong? Did she know the danger she was in? Or did it all happen so quickly she never saw it coming? The community's grief was immediate. News spread fast in Milwaukee's LGBTQ circles, hitting like a wave of heartbreak. Another trans woman? Gone too soon? Another life lost under violent, mysterious circumstances. Candlelight vigils appeared on street corners, voices trembling as they demanded answers. Friends clutched photos of Peaches, their tears reflecting the flames of candles, whispering that she deserved so much more than this. But grief, no matter how heavy, does not erase questions. The case raised uncomfortable doubts. Was this targeted violence, another act of hate against a transgender woman, or was it personal, a conflict that spiraled into something deadly? And if it was personal, who in her life carried the kind of rage or fear that could pull a trigger and end her life so brutally? Police investigators promised answers, but the trail was tangled. Witnesses were hesitant, some too scared to speak, others unwilling to betray trust. For a community already living in the margins, cooperating with law enforcement wasn't always a safe choice. And as days turned into weeks, one truth remained clear. Peaches had been silenced, and only those closest to her held the pieces of the puzzle that could explain why. Her family, devastated, struggled with more than grief. They faced the cruel reality that even in death, Peaches wasn't always respected. Some headlines misgendered her. Some whispers questioned her lifestyle, as if who she was could justify the violence she suffered. It's a pain unique to families of transgender victims, mourning a loved one, while also fighting for the dignity of their memory. And yet, through the pain, her family and friends made a promise. They would not let her story fade. They would demand justice. They would speak her name, and they would ensure that what happened to her was not buried under statistics. Because Peaches Armstrong wasn't a statistic. She was a person, a complicated, vibrant person, whose story still demands to be told. But here's the haunting question that lingers. On that night, as the car rolled down the quiet Milwaukee street, who was sitting beside her? Who pulled the trigger that ended her life? And why? There is much more to this story that will amaze you if you find it worth listening to. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The police arrived quickly after the 911 call, but the damage had already been done. The car sat angled awkwardly against the curb, headlights still on, the windshield fractured with spiderweb cracks. Officers approached with caution, flashlights sweeping across the street. Inside, Peaches Armstrong lay motionless. For a brief moment, the silence felt heavier than the sound of gunfire had been. Milwaukee has seen its share of violence, but this felt different. It wasn't just the brutality of it, it was the sense that this killing wasn't random. Something about the scene suggested intent. The shooter knew where she would be, knew when to strike. But in those early hours, the only certainty was that a young woman was gone, and whoever had been with her had disappeared into the night. Investigators started the process that always begins the same way. Retrace the victim's last steps. Surveillance footage pulled from nearby businesses showed Peaches hours earlier, alive, smiling, her long hair catching the glow of neon lights as she walked with friends. Witnesses recalled laughter, maybe some playful teasing, and no sign of trouble. But somewhere between that carefree energy and the stillness of the crime scene, something shifted. Her phone records revealed a string of calls and messages in the hours before her death. One in particular stood out, a late-night exchange with a man whose name police initially withheld. Whoever he was, he had been persistent, urging her to meet. Some friends later said Peaches had confided that she was nervous about him, that he had a temper. Others insisted she brushed it off, determined not to let fear dictate her life. That tension between caution and courage defined so much of Peaches' existence. Living as a transgender woman meant carrying constant awareness of danger. She knew the statistics. She knew how many trans women, especially women of color, never made it to 30. And yet, she refused to live in hiding. For Peaches, authenticity wasn't negotiable, but authenticity often put her on a collision course with risk. Some people embraced her, others rejected her. And some, perhaps, carried secret feelings they didn't want the world to see. Those hidden desires and the shame that sometimes accompanied them could turn toxic, even deadly. When detectives knocked on doors and asked questions, they encountered walls of silence. Some friends were too scared to talk, others were evasive, hinting at tension in Peach's personal life but unwilling to give names. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they knew the cost of speaking up. The streets in Milwaukee had long memories, and cooperation with police wasn't always forgiven. Still, a picture began to form. Peaches was navigating a relationship, or at least a connection, with someone who wasn't ready to be seen with her. Someone who feared exposure, someone who may have been living a double life. And in that double life lay the seeds of destruction. Her family, meanwhile, struggled to balance their grief with a new role they never asked for. Advocates. Her mother, fighting back tears, told reporters that Peaches had always been strong, always herself, even when the world made it hard. She begged anyone with information to come forward. Her words carried the rawness of a parent who not only lost a child but also feared her story would be twisted, reduced, or forgotten. But while family and friends mourned, investigators dug deeper. They discovered that Peaches had been seen leaving with someone the night she died. Witnesses placed her in a car, the same car later riddled with bullets, alongside a man they described as nervous, jumpy, glancing over his shoulder as if being followed. Who was he, and why, after the shooting, had he vanished without a trace? The unanswered questions didn't just haunt investigators, they haunted the community. At vigils, people spoke not only of grief but of anger. Anger that trans women kept turning up in police reports, anger that justice seemed slow, anger that society treated these deaths as routine instead of tragedies. She was more than a headline, one friend whispered at a candlelight vigil. She was light. And yet, as the candles flickered in the summer night, another truth settled in. Whoever pulled that trigger was still out there. Free. For detectives, the pressure grew. Leads dried up, but one fact remained impossible to ignore. Someone in Peach's circle knew more than they were saying. Silence might protect them for now, but silence could also shield a killer, and so the case stood at a painful standstill. A young woman's life cut short. A family desperate for closure. A community demanding answers, and a shadowy figure, the last person seen with her somewhere out there, carrying secrets that could break this case wide open. The haunting question remains. Was Peaches killed because of who she was, or because of who she loved? And if the answer lies in that difference, what does it reveal about the dangers faced by women like her every single day? There is still much to discover, and the truth that awaits in the next part of this story will force us to face things that many people would rather avoid. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Detectives working the case knew one thing for certain. Murders like this didn't happen in a vacuum. Somewhere in Peaches Armstrong's world, in her phone records, her friendships, or the late-night rendezvous she rarely spoke about, there were answers. The challenge was separating rumor from truth, loyalty from fear. The first real lead came from a grainy surveillance clip taken not far from the scene. It showed Peaches' car driving slowly through the intersection, headlights glowing against the dark. In the passenger seat, barely visible, was the shadow of a man. His features were indistinct, but his posture told a story, tense, hunched, as if weighed down by something more than the night itself. When investigators froze the frame and showed it to people close to Peaches, reactions varied. Some shrugged, claiming they couldn't tell. Others looked away too quickly, muttering that they didn't want to get involved. It was clear. Whoever that man was, people recognized him. And they were terrified to speak his name aloud. Behind closed doors, though, whispers spread. There had been someone in Peaches's life, a man who treated their connection like a secret, a man who sometimes lashed out in anger when he felt cornered. He wasn't officially her boyfriend, at least not in the way the world understood the word. But he was present enough that friends knew his absence after her death was no coincidence. Police tried to track him down, but he seemed to evaporate. No work address, no fixed residence, just scattered sightings from people who were reluctant to go on record. To some, he was a ghost. To others, a threat. And that made the investigation harder by the day. Meanwhile, the public's grief transformed into something sharper. Outrage. Activists and community leaders held press conferences, demanding accountability. They reminded the city that Peaches was not the first transgender woman lost to violence in Milwaukee, and that until the cycle was broken, she would not be the last. Candles, posters, chants of her name. The vigils grew louder, more insistent, as if sheer force of love could bring answers faster. But in the shadows of those vigils, fear also grew. Friends confided in hushed tones that they worried the killer might still be among them, attending memorials, watching quietly, blending into the crowd. It was a chilling thought. The person who ended Peaches's life could be standing just feet away from people demanding justice. For detectives, the pressure mounted. Every day without an arrest risked the case going cold. They turned to her digital footprint, combing through her social media posts, her text messages, her call history. Patterns emerged: late-night conversations with a number she never saved under a name. Messages that began with tenderness, but sometimes spiraled into heated arguments. The sender always insisted on secrecy, warning her not to tell anyone about him. It painted a familiar but devastating picture. A relationship built on shame. For Peaches, it may have been a chance at love, or at least companionship. For him, it was something to be hidden at all costs. And shame, investigators knew, can turn dangerous when threatened with exposure. Her family, meanwhile, faced a cruel double burden. They were grieving the loss of their daughter, and at the same time, they were forced to defend her identity to strangers who questioned her very existence. Reporters misgendered her. Online commenters spewed cruelty. Each word cut deeper, a reminder that even in death, Peaches wasn't safe from judgment. Her mother's voice shook at a press conference when she said, "She was my child. She was loved. That's all that should matter." Yet even as the family fought for dignity, the investigation revealed darker truths. Some friends admitted, reluctantly, that Peaches had confided in them about feeling unsafe with the man she had been seeing. She worried he was unstable, quick to anger. She sometimes joked that if anything ever happened to her, they'd know where to look. At the time, they brushed it off. Now, those words felt chillingly prophetic. Still, without a name, police were chasing shadows. They traced the mysterious number from her phone, but it led to a prepaid cell, purchased in cash. Whoever this man was, he had taken steps to hide his trail. That only made detectives more certain. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated. As weeks turned into months, frustration grew. The community wanted answers. Her family wanted justice, and police wanted a suspect who seemed determined never to be found. The deeper they dug, the clearer one thing became. Someone in Peaches's circle was holding back. Someone knew exactly who had been in that car with her, and their silence was the shield keeping him safe. The tragedy of Peaches' death became a test not only for the justice system, but for the people who had loved her. Would fear keep them quiet, or would someone finally break the silence, naming the man in the shadows who had taken her life? Because the truth was out there. It always island. The question was whether anyone was brave enough to speak it aloud. And so we're left with another haunting question. In a city filled with whispers, who finally dares to tell the truth? There's much more ahead, and the next part of this story will take us closer to that hidden name, closer to uncovering the man who vanished the night Peaches was killed. If you don't want to miss it, make sure you're subscribed. Because what comes next changes everything. For weeks after the shooting, it seemed as though Milwaukee itself was holding its breath. Police worked the case day after day, sifting through dead ends and recycled rumors, while the community kept lighting candles, praying that answers would finally surface. Yet the silence remained heavy, unbroken, suffocating. Everyone knew someone was out there with the truth. The question was, when would they break? Detectives leaned on everything they had. They re-interviewed friends, combed back through surveillance footage, and tightened their focus on the anonymous man Peaches had been seeing. The prepaid phone, the secrecy, the sudden disappearance, all of it pointed to a relationship built on lies. But suspicion alone couldn't close the case. They needed a name, and more than that, they needed someone willing to stand behind it. That moment came quietly, almost unexpectedly. A young woman, a friend of Peaches, walked into the precinct one afternoon. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, scrolling through messages she had been too scared to share before. In those messages was proof of the man's anger, his desperate need for secrecy, and his threats. "She can't tell anyone," one message read. "If she does, it's over." The woman admitted she had been terrified to come forward. She knew the man, had seen him around, had even watched the way he shadowed Peaches at times, but fear had silenced her fear of retaliation, fear of being the next target. Now, though, her guilt outweighed her fear. "She didn't deserve this," she whispered. "Somebody has to say his name." That single act of courage shifted everything. Detectives finally had a lead strong enough to pursue. They traced the man through connections, piecing together where he worked odd jobs, the corners he was known to hang around, the places he disappeared to when he didn't want to be found. He had no fixed address, no official paper trail, but now he had a name. And with a name came the chance to prove what had happened in that car. The revelation hit Peaches' family hard. For months, they had been caught between grief and uncertainty. Now, the shadow that haunted them began to take shape. Her mother wept when she heard the name, not because it was familiar, but because it made her daughter's death feel less like a senseless tragedy and more like a betrayal. Someone real, flesh and blood, had made the decision to end her life. It wasn't fate. It wasn't random. It was a choice. Still, identifying a suspect was only the beginning. Building a case would be harder. Witnesses were still reluctant, worried about their safety. Some agreed to talk but refused to go on record. Others vanished from the investigation altogether, moving away or changing numbers. Each step forward seemed to come with 2 steps back. Meanwhile, the community's grief continued to spill into the streets. At a vigil outside City Hall, activists held up signs demanding justice. Not just for Peaches, but for every transgender woman whose death had been ignored or forgotten. The crowd chanted her name, their voices echoing against the glass walls of government buildings. "Say her name," they cried. Peaches Armstrong! In that moment, Peaches' story became bigger than the case itself. It became a rallying cry, a demand for recognition. She was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of resilience in the face of hatred and silence. And yet, the painful truth remained. Symbols don't bring killers to justice. Evidence does. Detectives worked to connect the dots. Ballistics confirmed the gun used in the shooting was never recovered, but shell casings matched the caliber of a weapon the suspect was rumored to carry. Phone records placed him in the area the night of the murder. Witness statements described his behavior afterward: nervous, evasive, disappearing from familiar hangouts. Piece by piece, a picture emerged of a man unraveling after committing an unthinkable act. But why had he done it? That was the question that kept everyone awake at night. Was it panic? Fear that his secret would be exposed? Was it rage, fueled by shame and self-loathing? Or was it something colder, a calculated decision to silence a woman who loved openly when he could not? For Peaches' family, the why mattered almost as much as the who. Understanding his motive meant understanding the danger their daughter had lived with, the storm she had walked into without fully realizing it. Her mother often replayed their last conversation, searching for clues. Did Peaches sense it? Did she know that the man she was with was capable of turning violent? The truth is, she may have. Friends recalled her mentioning his temper, his paranoia, the way he sometimes accused her of talking about him behind his back. But like so many women in similar situations, she may have believed she could handle it, that her loyalty, her patience, her love could calm his storms. It's a dangerous hope, and for Peaches, it was a hope that cost her life. As the investigation reached this turning point, the silence that had protected her killer began to crumble. One witness had spoken. More were ready. Slowly, the weight of secrecy began to lift, and for the first time since that night of gunfire, justice no longer felt impossible. But even with a suspect, even with whispers turning into statements, one haunting uncertainty lingered. Would the system treat Peaches' case with the same urgency, the same determination, as any other? Or would the fact that she was a transgender woman mean her life and her death would be placed in the margins once again? The tension was unbearable, and it was about to break wide open. Because the next step in this story isn't just about finding the suspect. It's about what happens when he is finally confronted, when the truth is forced into the light. And the way he reacts will shock everyone. The man investigators had been chasing for months finally had a name. With that name came fragments of a life, a string of jobs that never lasted, addresses that were little more than borrowed couches and cheap motels, and a reputation that followed him through Milwaukee's streets. People described him as volatile, quick to anger, the kind of man who hid his insecurities behind violence. And now, he was a suspect in the murder of Peaches Armstrong. Finding him, however, was another challenge altogether. He knew he was being hunted. He changed phones, ducked familiar neighborhoods, and relied on people too afraid to betray him. Each time detectives thought they were close, he slipped away, as if the city itself was protecting him. The investigation stretched thin. Every false lead, draining time and energy. But fate has a way of breaking silence. One night, nearly 3 months after Peaches was killed, a tip came in. The caller was anonymous, their voice shaking. They claimed the man was staying with a cousin on the outskirts of the city, lying low, restless, and paranoid. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Police surrounded the small house in the early hours of the morning, their squad cars tucked into the shadows. The air was tense, heavy, as officers whispered instructions over radios. A spotlight suddenly snapped on, flooding the house with light. A voice boomed through a megaphone. "Come out with your hands up." For a moment, nothing. Just silence. Then, movement. The curtains shifted. The faint outline of a man darting away from the window. Officers braced for the worst. A standoff loomed, but after nearly 15 minutes of shouting commands, the door opened. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped outside, hands raised. His face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion. He looked less like a predator and more like a man cornered by the weight of his own choices. The arrest was swift, but the questions were endless. Why had he run? Why had he hidden? And most of all, why had he killed Peaches? In the interrogation room, detectives pressed him. At first, he denied everything. He hadn't been with her that night, he insisted. He didn't know where she had been or who she had been with, but his story crumbled under the weight of evidence. Phone records placed him with her. Witnesses had seen them together. The prepaid cell phone, the messages, the surveillance footage, it all pointed to him. Finally, when denial was no longer possible, his defense shifted. He claimed it hadn't been planned. He painted himself as the victim, a man trapped in circumstances he couldn't control. He admitted to being with Peaches that night, but said things got out of hand. He spoke of an argument, accusations, her threatening to reveal their relationship. His words dripped with defensiveness, as if the blame belonged not on him, but on the woman whose life he had ended. For investigators, his story was infuriating but familiar. They had heard it before: the narrative of shame and secrecy. The idea that a man's fear of being exposed justified violence. It was the same tragic script that had claimed the lives of so many transgender women before Peaches. A cycle of hidden relationships, of men who couldn't reconcile desire with prejudice, turning lethal when secrets threatened to surface. Outside the police station, news of the arrest spread like wildfire. For Peaches's family, it was a bittersweet moment. Relief washed over them. Relief that someone would finally be held accountable. But the relief was laced with bitterness. No arrest, no trial, no sentence could bring their daughter back. And hearing his excuses only deepened the wound. At another vigil, Peaches's name was spoken with even more urgency. Her face, smiling from photographs held aloft by mourners, became a symbol of resilience. She lived her truth, one speaker said. And for that, she paid the highest price. But we will not let her death be in vain. Yet, the arrest was not the end. It was only the beginning of a long, painful fight for justice. The suspect now had lawyers, arguments, and a defense strategy. He would claim it wasn't murder but a moment of passion, a mistake, a misunderstanding. He would try to twist the narrative, turning Peaches from a victim into a complication in his story. And so, as the case moved toward trial, another question began to loom. Would a jury see through his excuses, or would Peaches once again be judged not for who she was, but for how the world chose to see her? The weight of that question hung over Milwaukee like a storm cloud. For her family, for her friends, for a community that had already lost too much. The fight was far from over. Justice had taken a step forward, But the path ahead was still uncertain. And this is where the story takes its most dramatic turn yet. Because the truth revealed in the courtroom would force everyone to confront the darkest part of this case. Not just how Peaches died, but why. There's more to this story. And what happens next might change how you look at everything that's happened. Don't miss the sequel. And if you want to hear the shocking final chapter in Peaches' story, make sure you subscribe. The trial of Peaches Armstrong's killer began under a heavy shadow. From the very first day, the courthouse was filled with her family, her friends, and members of Milwaukee's LGBTQ+ community, all dressed in shades of pink, the color Peaches loved most. They gathered not only to honor her memory but to make sure that her story, her truth, was not erased in the sterile language of court documents and legal arguments. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. On one side sat the defendant, the man who once shared her company in secret, but now sat shackled by his own actions. His lawyers painted him as a man overcome by emotion, arguing that what had happened wasn't planned. They tried to convince the jury that this wasn't murder, but a tragic moment of passion, something he hadn't meant to do. But prosecutors told a different story. They laid out the evidence piece by piece. The prepaid phone, the messages, the surveillance footage, the lies he spun in the days after her death. They showed jurors how he had stalked her movements, how he had destroyed evidence, how his fear of being exposed had curdled into violence. This wasn't an accident, they argued. This was intentional. This was murder. As the trial unfolded, the details were gut-wrenching. Jurors saw photos of the crime scene, shattered glass glinting like ice on the pavement. They heard about the phone records that traced her final moments, messages that carried the weight of her last choices. They listened as witnesses described the fear she confided in them, the tension in her voice as she spoke of a man who wanted to keep her hidden. And then came the most painful testimony of all from Peaches' mother. Standing in front of the jury, she spoke of her daughter's laughter, her love of dancing, the way she lit up every room she entered. Her voice cracked as she described the emptiness left behind, the birthdays missed, the calls that would never come. "She was my baby," she whispered. And in that moment, even the walls of the courtroom seemed to tremble under the weight of her grief. For the defense, there was no answer to that kind of truth. They could argue about intent, about definitions, about degrees of guilt, but they could not erase the humanity of the woman their client had taken from the world. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days of silence, of waiting, of holding collective breath. And then, at last, the verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of silencing a woman whose only crime had been living her truth. The courtroom erupted in tears, tears of relief, of anger, of sorrow. Peaches' family clung to each other, whispering prayers of thanks. For them, justice had finally spoken, though it would never be enough to fill the empty chair at their table. The judge sentenced him to decades in prison, a punishment meant to mirror the gravity of what he had done. But for those who loved Peaches, the sentence was more than just time. It was recognition. Recognition that her life had value, that her death was not just another statistic, that the violence she faced mattered enough to be answered with justice. Outside the courthouse, candles were lit once more. The community gathered to say her name, to remind the world that Peaches Armstrong was more than the way she died. She was joy. She was resilience. She was love. And though her life had been stolen, her spirit remained. Yet, as powerful as that moment of justice was, it also carried a sobering truth. Peaches' story was not an isolated tragedy. Across the country, trans women, especially trans women of color, continued to face violence at alarming rates. Many of their cases never made it this far. Many never saw a courtroom, never saw their killers held accountable. Peaches' case became a rallying cry. Advocates pointed to her story as proof of what needed to change: better protection for trans women, more resources for communities in danger, and above all, a justice system willing to see their lives as equal, as sacred, as worth fighting for. For her mother, the verdict was both an ending and a beginning. She spoke to reporters after the trial, her voice steady despite the tears. "We got justice for Peaches today," she said. "But tomorrow, we fight for all the others. No other mother should have to stand where I stood." And that is Peaches Armstrong's legacy. Not only the joy she brought to those who knew her, but the fire her story lit in a community determined to make sure her death would not be in vain. As the candles burned low and the crowd dispersed into the Milwaukee night, her name lingered on every lip. Peaches Armstrong. A name that carried pain, but also power. A name that would not be forgotten. Because in the end, this is not just the story of a murder. It is the story of a woman who dared to live her truth, a family who refused to let her memory fade, and a community that turned grief into strength. And for those of us listening, the question remains: how many more names must we learn the hard way before change truly comes? If you've been following this journey, thank you for standing with Peaches. Her story matters, her life matters, and her name will echo far beyond this screen. Make sure you're subscribed, because stories like Peaches's must be told, must be heard, and must never be forgotten.